100 years ago, the small town of Rosewood, Florida was a thriving black community. Rosewood had its own baseball team, several black churches, and black-owned businesses. But in January of 1923, at the height of the lynch mob period, Rosewood, Florida would never be the same.
So it didn't take much to incite the riot. And so I was told that there was a mob already in some of the neighboring towns and communities because a white woman had claimed that she had been raped by 8 African-American men. And so when the word spread to them about Rosewood, that's all it took. Fled into the woods here, the swamps. It was cold. She said it was like 13, 14 degrees. She said the ground was like frozen. And you see the palm trees here. That's what they use to try to stay warm, and some of the leaves on the ground.
In the aftermath of the massacre that was built on a lie, 6 black citizens lost their lives while survivors evacuated by train into Gainesville. To add insult to an unrepairable injury, a 1923 grand jury found insufficient evidence to prosecute any of the white men responsible. This left survivors of Rosewood to grieve in decades of fear and silence.
And I know coming up as a kid, I would go outside, go on the porch where my grandma would be sitting on the porch, and she would be sad a lot, crying. And I said, "Why are you so sad, Grandma?" She said, "I don't want to talk about it."
For 50 years, the people who survived Rosewood lived under a vow of silence. They did not talk about it outside of the family at all.
And then when she broke down and told me about Rosewood, and she said, "You need to prepare yourself," because there was a documentary that was coming out of on 60 Minutes with Ed Bradley.
The 60-minute segment in 1983 brought national attention to the Rosewood Massacre, but it wouldn't be until 1992 that Arnett Doctor, the son of a Rosewood survivor, would embark on a path to justice by working with law firm Holland & Knight.
Arnett went and laid the case out. Arnett had did a tremendous job as far as connecting all the dots. The family members, property owners, he had found birth certificates, death certificates. I mean, he was a walking Rosewood.
He's the one who we considered to be our primary client. He was the glue that held it all together.
A lot of the family members didn't want to talk about the story of Rosewood. They had vowed to take it to their grave, even my grandmother. They were upset with Arnett.
When deciding whether to take the case, it was the honesty and strength of Rosewood survivor Minnie Lee Langley that sealed the deal for attorneys Stephen Hanlon.
She was really open about what happened. She remembered everything. And she was like 8 or 9 years old, and she remembered everything.
And he said when he had talked to Minnie Lee Langley, she had solidified the story because she was straightforward with him about what happened. And that was a winning factor for him from an attorney standpoint.
The Rosewood case was then brought to the Florida legislature in the form of an equitable claims bill.
They're not used often, but primarily they are situations where a citizen has a claim against the state of Florida for a personal injury or damage based on acts or failure to act by the state.
These people had lost property. They were law-abiding citizens, but they didn't get the protection that they, should have gotten.
After the claims bill was presented, the Florida Speaker of the House commissioned an academic investigation. The study was led by FSU historian Dr. Maxine Jones and co-led by FAMU professor Dr. Larry Rivers. Jones and Rivers worked alongside FSU professor William R. Rogers, FSU graduate student Tom Dye, and UF professor David R. Colburn.
At the time, I had no idea that this was as big as it was, that our research would play a major role, and that this would set a precedent, in a sense.
They interviewed each one of those survivors who were willing to tell their stories, and Minnie Lee Langley, of course, and Willie Evans. They interviewed actually each of the survivors that were willing to tell their stories. And they were able to come back and tell them honestly, yeah, it did happen, because the state of Florida tried to say it never happened.
The report that was created was so substantive, so significant, that it became the platform on which we refiled the bill in 1994.
Although the study presented irrefutable evidence and detailed personal accounts to the state, the fight to win over legislators was far from over.
Arnett would be at the Capitol when they came out, I don't care if it was 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, and he would tell them, I just want to have a hearing for my family. And a lot of the state legislators, they were trying to avoid it. They didn't want to hear it.
They didn't want to deal with it. They didn't want to deal with the public reaction to it. They didn't want to deal with the press. They simply didn't want to deal with it.
It was huge because no one had ever heard of Rosewood, before, and you were basically saying that the state didn't do everything in its power to protect, all of its citizens. So it was big news.
To bring something emotional, controversial, divisive, like reparations and compensation for the survivors of a massacre and the burning of a town 70 years before just wasn't on anybody's agenda.
But for Arnett Doctor and the families of Rosewood, House Bill 591 represented more than just an agenda pushing for reparations.
And again, it wasn't just about the money, even though the money was important. It was giving these elderly Black people an opportunity to tell their story and have people listen.
I think what mattered most to them was that somebody said, we acknowledge that we failed 70 years ago to protect you, and that until today, we haven't stepped up to protect you, but that we're doing it now.
In the closing debates on the controversial House bill came a string of public testimonies. For the first time, Rosewood survivors spoke directly to the state about the trauma they endured as children and the life that was taken from them.
It was mostly Arnett, my mom, my Aunt Vera Hamilton, and all the survivors who went before the legislature to tell the story. Minnie Langley, all the ones that's listed on there, Mr. Hall, him and his sister Mary Hall, Arnett Goins, my great uncle Willie Evans.
No one cracked, I didn't see like anyone just fall apart or anything like that. But it was very painful, and it was really painful for the families because this is the first time we was hearing this.
Michelle Williams recalls the testimony of her grandmother, Minnie Lee Langley.
There's a photograph of her after she testified, and on the stage she was real tough, but then after she testified, she went back and took her seat, and she just broke down in tears.
Hearing them talk about what happened and about the community that they lost, and they lost a lot, and the legacy that families would like to pass on to their children and their children's children, they didn't have an opportunity.
Nobody in that room had any question about the legitimacy and the importance of what we were doing in the legislature.
On May 4, 1994, Florida Governor Lawton Chiles held a ceremonial signing of House Bill 591, surrounded by Rosewood survivors and families. The Florida governor remarked that through this legislation, Rosewood will never be forgotten.
This is, even though it was a tragedy, it's still history, and the fact that it even came out was a miracle in itself.
Their story could no longer be swept under the rug. It was a part of not only Florida's history, but the history of this country.
The bill is the only one in the country to ever compensate African Americans for racial violence. The state paid Rosewood survivors for property loss and emotional damages, set up a scholarship fund for descendants, promised that Florida law enforcement would further investigate the massacre, and require that the Rosewood massacre be taught in Florida classrooms.
For our family to actually be the first to, lead the way for other families, other tragedies, I think it's an honor.
We have successfully graduated 350 descendants from college. That is amazing, from teachers all the way to doctors.
Here we are 30 years later. And as historians, we oftentimes don't get a chance to change lives or have an impact. But I think what we did with Rosewood did have an impact.
We're the first African Americans in America getting a form of reparations. Even though they didn't use the word reparations, they used claims bill, but that's what it was. It was reparations.
In the past and currently, the concept of reparations is considered by some as unrealistic, but because of the courage of Rosewood survivors, the determination of Arnett Doctor, the research put in by Dr. Jones and her team, and the legal maneuverings of Holland and Knight, reparations became a reality.
People just don't realize the sacrifice of Arnett. He opened the doors for many others to be able to come to the table and be able to use the language from the bill to be able to help them possibly get some form of compensation or reparation.
The real legacy, I think, of Rosewood is that the governmental entities for the first time took responsibility for what happened. And that's what mattered, I believe, to Minnie Lee Langley and Lee Ruth Davis and Arnett Goins and Willie Evans.
The legacy of Rosewood lives on through Gregory Doctor and his foundation, the Descendants of Rosewood. Through the foundation, Gregory Doctor and his wife, Paris Doctor, work to preserve their family history while sparking conversation about America's past, present, and future.
That's what this foundation, the Descendants of Rosewood, that's what we want to do. We want to be able to work with these different foundations and educate people and go into the schools and travel across the country and educate people, because this is part of American history.
No one now is as afraid to bring things to the forefront. They're not afraid to talk about it. When, before it was just it was kept a secret because everyone was afraid to talk about it. But now I think people have gotten more courage, they're bolder, and they're just taking a bigger stand when it comes to any kind of racial, situations.
We want to be able to have this conversation not just about Rosewood, but other massacres throughout the United States, especially Tulsa, Oklahoma, Groveland, and many other massacres.
This past January, the Descendants of Rosewood traveled back to Rosewood to hold a wreath-laying ceremony honoring what was lost 100 years ago. Later in the month, the foundation held a centennial celebration at the University of Florida, celebrating the progress made in the United States while also passing the torch of progress on to the next generation.
When we had the soil ceremony, we had approximately 450 people out here. They see the kids running up and down through the property. They had never been out here before. Arnett's grandkids, his great-grandkids came out. It was amazing. It was amazing.
We all have history. We all have a story. And I think our children now need to really go back to the beginning where we really listened to our adults and our elders and our parents and grandparents. Just go back and listen to them.
I was able to have my grandchildren there. They're the ones got to carry the sun. And they didn't realize the rich history that they have.
It's our job, our responsibility as survivors, descendants, to make sure that our children know what our family before us went through. And it's not because they went through it for us, but it's because we're here because of what they went through.
I'm Hayley Seibert reporting.